Pressure is on U.S. policymakers, FDA, and academic centers in the U.S. alike to rise to the challenge in running first-in-human trials quickly and efficiently. Challenges that are coming from China, Australia, and other countries in Europe and beyond. I'm Jeff Cranmer, host of the BioCentury This Week podcast. Today, I'll speak with my colleagues on how stakeholders in the U.S. are responding to this challenge. We'll also discuss the next frontiers of federated learning in drug discovery and a banner week for biotech IPOs. 4 biotechs raising more than $1.2 billion. Joining me to discuss all of this on today's BioCentury This Week podcast, Editor-in-Chief Simone Fishburne, still on the best coast, which we love to see, my fellow executive editor, Selena Koch, and Lindsay Martin, our biopharma analyst. Okay, FDA is moving fast on an expedited IND pilot. Representative Auchincloss is pushing his vision for modernizing clinical trials in the U.S., and meanwhile, academic medical centers here in the States own many of the decisions that could speed the timelines for starting first-in-human clinical trials. Simone, Selena, we've been talking a lot about first-in-human trials for a few months now. Where do you want to begin here?
So, Jeff, thanks for the introduction. I think maybe a year ago, I wrote a commentary and I made the point that because of what China's doing in clinical trials and first-in-human trials, it could actually have just a massive impact, positive impact globally on expediting first-in-human studies, right? On just basically translational medicine. And I think that nowhere is that more clear than, I wrote a piece last week about academic medical centers. And the reason I say this is that the academic medical centers hold a lot of decisions in their own hands that could actually expedite the process by which you get first-in-human data, but certainly by which you start up human clinical trials. And the reality is that nothing there is new. All of these things have been in their hands, and we can elaborate on that in a few minutes. And we covered this in a panel in our Seattle Grand Rounds meeting. But the difference maker is that China has just injected this sense of urgency. And that's what the academic medical centers are saying. They're like, we actually can't, people look at it and they go, yeah, what are the chances that all these universities are suddenly going to clean up their IRBs and streamline things? And the reason it might be different this time is because of this global competitive pressure. And actually, they're looking at the idea that maybe they will not retain their predominant position forever.
Nothing like a foreign rival to drive motivation, yeah?
Right. Yeah. That's what competition's all about, right? Yeah. Isn't that how it works?
I mean, there does seem to be like a rare amount of alignment across FDA and HHS and Congress and even these individual academic centers you're talking about. So it's kind of a window for change, maybe.
Totally agree. So there's a window for change. So I want to just dig for a couple of minutes because we spent a lot of time talking about what FDA can do and what policymakers can do. But most of the trials are run at, hospitals with academic medical centers. And so there are a fair number of bottlenecks. So one of the really big ones that everyone talks about is contracting, right? So how could they speed that up? Well, in this panel, there's 2 sides of that. The academics are like, IP, give it up, okay? You should get IP on a discovery that you make. You should not get IP or even try to be getting IP. If you take Pfizer's drug and you just run a trial on it, that's not your drug. That's Pfizer's drug, is what they're saying. So extended negotiations.
Like arguing for new indications being like theirs.
Right.
Is a sticking point. Yeah.
Right. So, and it's, held up for a long time. And then they say the other side of it, farmers or industry companies, they come back all the time with protocol amendments, right? Protocol amendments, even before the damn protocol is, they just baked the protocol and now there's an amendment. And every time they do that, they set the clock back to 0. And so their argument is, you guys have got to stop doing that, sort of come in. Another angle, which we won't go into, but both sides, indemnification, that is the amount of time they spend haggling over indemnification, where really it should be templated. This kind of thing should be templated.
That was just what I was going to ask you about. To what extent can like sort of standardizing some of the contracting parts of the contracts, to what extent can that take time out of the process?
It totally could make a difference, with a big but, as it were. So there is it's called the ACTA, Accelerated Clinical Trial Agreement, as a starting point template that was hammered out by like 25 academic medical centers and various other stakeholders. And actually using it really does reduce the time. The flip side of it is that it's optional. A lot of places aren't using it. Pharma companies tend to want to just create their own bilateral agreements with academic medical centers, and that kind of leaves the smaller companies out in the cold. So part of the issue is adoption, right? There are plenty of things they could do. There are duplicative processes at Texas Medical Center. Bill McKeown, when he took over, he said there were 29 centers and 29 IRBs, and that makes no sense whatsoever. So they can centralize IRBs, they can do that. And I think it really comes back to what we said before, which is, where's the will, right? Why change something? Academia is not known for that. One thing I wanted to point out, Karen Knudsen from the Parker Institute, she actually had an interesting thought, and she was sort of saying NCI can do a lot on this front. She said everybody wants that NCI designation, right? But what NCI could do is say, well, if you want this designation, you're going to have to get your startup times to be within X number of days. And so there are certain levers that could be pulled here and there to influence it. And, I don't know what you think, Selena. I think the main difference is that nothing here is new except maybe the urgency.
Yeah, that seems right. Although, because no discussion is complete without bringing up artificial intelligence. I suppose that's new.
Yeah.
So how does that play in?
So, you can elaborate on this actually yourself, I think, but I think you're right that China is let's say, the stimulus for this, and AI might be the enabler. And so I think AI will be incredibly important for site selection. One of the big issues they talk about is site selection and recruitment. So we already know AI is being used there. I think that there is a lot of duplication. So you have basically at least three parts of this process which are overlapping. So you've got IND review by FDA, then you've got the IRB, then you've got scientific review councils. And so putting all the data together, for each of these is incredibly cumbersome. What is the information they want? So I think that there's probably a lot of places within that. I don't know if you want to elaborate on where AI can speed things up.
Ushering in what's called the just-in-time trial seems like an avenue where, you open a site when an eligible patient is identified, right? Rather than kind of opening numerous sites and just seeing where you might get a participant.
Simone, in your article, you mentioned that fraud and abuse charges is a big issue that academic medical centers are thinking about. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's going to bring us, that's a good question, Lindsay, and that's going to bring us into the political realm that I know that Jeff wants to go to. There's a good segue here because, again, it's always been an issue, but this is something that is different right now because the Trump administration has really ramped up part of its war on academia. You could say the fraud and abuse, you've heard about this as Medicare fraud and Medicare and Medicaid fraud and abuse. And so there, the idea is that when the medical centers are running a trial, they have to appropriately charge either Medicare or Medicaid or the sponsor. And so they spend ridiculous amounts of time on this. It's not that the legislation requires them specifically to spend this amount of time on, every CPC count or whatever, but they do because they are so worried about the administration going after them. So that's like a new curveball that's been sent their way, and they spend large amounts of time on that. I don't know. I know you were talking about it before. I don't know if AI can help that.
I'm wondering, what do you think some of the things that could streamline that would be?
Good question, Lindsay. As a matter of fact, we're going to dig into that in our annual Back to School project, which is coming shortly. And we're going to dive deep into all things phase 1 trials, how to expedite the various phases of it. Yeah.
I look forward to reading that.
And of course, Back to School is BioCentury's annual forward-looking analysis that assesses a broad issue critical to the biopharma industry. We'll publish our 34th installment of the series in another week. Stay tuned for that. It's one of the biggest pieces of analysis we put out each year. Staying with this theme and kind of turning to Washington, our listeners will note our Washington editor, Steve Usden, you haven't heard his voice. He is off on vacation for a couple of weeks, recharging his batteries before things get going again in Washington at full tilt. But he did leave us with a couple of stories. One is focused on an initiative by Representative Jake Auchincloss, Democrat of Massachusetts, and he's making a push with an influential Republican, Morgan Griffith from Virginia, who's chair of the Health Subcommittee on ENC. And the centerpiece of the legislation they're working on is the Cures in Care initiative, which is seeking to create a network of point-of-care clinical trial platforms, which would essentially turn hospitals and clinics into ongoing research sites rather than treating clinical trials as separate standalone events.
Yeah. So NIH and ARPA-H would stand up at least 3 lead platforms in rare diseases and they're calling high burden chronic conditions and other unmet needs. They'd have a 1-year deadline for initial networks and 3 years for broader adoption of the models.
And it's modeled on Australia's clinical trial notification scheme, which allows trials to begin faster under a streamlined review process. Steve also wrote about what's happening at FDA, and he says that FDA is moving fast on an expedited IND pilot. Any thoughts on that, Selena?
Well, he's not here, but I'll quote him from his story here. He says, FDA has mobilized with a conviction that hasn't been seen since the COVID-19 pandemic. So basically, it put out a request for information in June. The comment period ends in just a couple of weeks. So get your comments in now if you want to provide feedback. But this is a IND pilot program where it's going to allow third-party organizations, which it's calling qualified research institutions, to join up with a sponsor, and they can apply jointly for this. Applications will open in September. And the third party is going to help the sponsor get their IND package together. So they're going to help them assemble and submit the various components in an iterative sort of process. And so these qualified research institutions obviously are going to have people there who have enough expertise to do this so that when the IND comes to the agency, the idea is fewer delays in the IND review process itself, fewer clinical holds afterwards, and fewer protocol amendments.
Palpable sense of urgency, Steve writes in the story, and maybe that's what it's going to take for the U.S. to get its house in order on first-in-human trials. You'll be able to read about this, as we've said, in the upcoming back-to-school package. I'll drop links into the show notes for Steve's couplet of stories. And with that, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back to discuss federated learning in drug discovery and the latest crop of biotech IPOs on NASDAQ.
This episode of BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the second BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Amsterdam, September 23rd to 25th. The second edition of BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe convenes the leaders shaping the future of biopharma. This time we meet in Amsterdam, September 23rd to 25th, gathering academic innovators, biotech CEOs, pharma R&D leaders and investors to debate the translational science that will define the next decade. Grand Rounds Europe focuses on what matters most: breakthrough biology, transformative technologies, and how to make early-stage R&D investable. Grand Rounds is where rigorous science meets real-world execution. Join BioCentury and regional host chairs Forbion and BGV and take a deep dive on translational opportunities in the Benelux region. BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe, where discovery moves toward impact. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
All right, we are back, and yes, we are gearing up for Grand Rounds in Amsterdam. Simone, what's getting you excited?
Oh, there are really a lot of exciting things. I'd actually going to pick a few, Jeff, and then maybe in some next few episodes we can highlight some others. But let me just continue this first in human theme for a minute, where we have two really great sessions. In one, I am going to have a fireside chat with Emma Cook, who is the current and soon to be outgoing head of EMA. And we will talk about what she sees, what the European Medical Agency is doing, and what she sees as the major issues there. We have another session, a frontier session, on how in China, the evolution of clinical trials is really reshaping global strategy. So a lot of synergy there with what we talked about. Give me 2 more minutes or 1 more minute to highlight 2 or 3 more sessions that I think are super cool. One is a keynote by Luke O'Neill. And he is a big, very well-known guy in immunology, more recently immunometabolism. His title of his talk includes the concept of why the mitochondria might be the enemy within the cell. So that is going to be a fun and interesting keynote. We also have a fireside chat with the new CEO of argenx, Karen Massey. My colleague Stephen Hansen will moderate that. And a last thing I want to tell you about, although I don't have the topic to reveal, but we will have another debate. This was hugely fun at the Cambridge Grand Rounds last year, where James Sabry of Biomarin and Yurt Mergers at Gilda Healthcare, they are going to be debating a topic which we will disclose in the coming weeks.
All right, that is.
Who doesn't love a debate, right?
I know it's been they've been quite fun. I recall from Cambridge last year. All right, Federated Learning. Lindsay, let me bring you back into the conversation. You've mentioned before that as AI models for discovery are commoditized, the models themselves become less important, while the underlying data become more important for differentiating. A big theme of Grand Rounds in Seattle, which happened in June. We do Grand Rounds in the US and in Europe at this point. The theme was that we don't have enough biological data. How is federated learning a potential approach to solving that problem?
That's right, Jeff. The data is becoming more important, and having proprietary information that you can train a model to have a better output is going to be a bigger differentiator than simply having a model itself. And so federated learning is an approach where companies pool their data together in effort to train a model to get a better output, but without ever actually sharing their proprietary information. So the idea is that each company benefits by having a better model output, but they still keep what matters to them in terms of having proprietary information. This has been an approach that in drug discovery has taken off more quickly recently. And now there are a couple different approaches, from Eli Lilly's Tune Labs to Apheris's platforms for federated learning and drug discovery. And so we have a few examples where companies are willing to do this, and the federated approach is being used in drug discovery.
Lindsay, let me ask you something, because I think for people in the field, they understand this intimately. And then for a lot of people who are less in the trenches, it's harder to conceptualize this concept of federated learning. right? So I think one of the points is that you're not necessarily giving up your crown jewels, right? You still
Right.
retain that information. And so the data sort of don't move anywhere. But how are the models, what do they take from the data? Obviously, it's anonymized, but how does that work? Maybe you can spell it out.
Yeah. So, for example, if a company wants to predict, say, absorption in an ADMET profile, they have endpoints for that property and data collected on the different endpoints in their programs, and they can give this data to the federated platform. They still hold the data, but the local model that they're using will learn from their data. And what is learned is then passed on to the bigger network. And so they are benefiting from the individual local information, but the general chemistry is passed on to the bigger picture message. And so when everyone is doing that, the bigger trunk model, or the main model that is learning from all of the individual companies, is going to improve because it's getting the general information each time that says whether or not, the prediction is better, learning information separately without ever giving the company's data to the general model.
So I have two more questions, a couple of follow-ups to that. One is, traditionally we've been talking about this for a while, for several years, but one of the issues has been interoperability. So does this federated system, and we've also been talking about federated learning as the solution to it, but it seems that now it's gaining traction in a way it didn't before. So is it solving interoperability, and to what degree is it AI or other things that are making this tractable now?
Simone, that's a good point in that all of these data are coming from different companies, and every company may be measuring things in a different way. They use different CROs. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the data. And when a model is measuring one output, you can't have all these different types of things that are not harmonized or standardized go into it. And so the federated approaches that we have now have made headway in tackling the heterogeneity problem. And there's kind of two main approaches that we're seeing being used in drug discovery right now. One is where the companies sort of pre-standardize their measurements. And so that is often used in protein structure, where companies are typically measuring very similar things. And so instead of the data being changed later on, it's really that everyone agrees to a standardized format, and that's what is used. Now, the second approach, and this is more commonly used for cases where the data or endpoints are, not the same. So like ADMET profiles, they could be testing different assay conditions, different assays themselves. The second approach doesn't make any attempt to standardize or harmonize the data. And I think this is really the key advancement in federated learning. So instead of trying to make everything the same, it's okay that the data are different from different companies. This is tackled by having that two-pronged model approach, where you have individual models that are trained on the company's specific data, and that passes on the general learned information to the bigger trunk model that's reaching out to all of the different trees that are within the network.
And you think it's fair then to say that where it's gaining traction is along the lines of things like ADMET? You gave the example of absorption, places where companies might hope that if we all, contribute something to this, that it will just be solved because our differentiation is going to be somewhere else.
Yeah. So, and this kind of ties back into Jeff's original question in terms of data scarcity. Where it's working right now are areas where there are more data. So small molecules, proteins to some degree in terms of like having the protein data bank. And then areas where it works less well are areas where data is more scarce. But the idea is that by combining the data that we do have, we're helping tackle that issue of data scarcity. I talked with FIH, and they told me that really the next frontier that we're currently working in right now is moving to those areas where there's less data. So large molecules, toxicity endpoints in ADMET. And then beyond that, areas where federated learning hasn't quite gotten there yet because there just isn't enough data, are things like in vivo pharmacokinetics. Afiris mentioned that even a well-resourced biotech that is measuring in vivo PK may only have 20 endpoints, and being able to train on 20 endpoints is just simply not enough. So the limit really is the amount of data being generated, not necessarily the ability to combine it.
So I want to go back to, what we were talking about before, which is why first in human trials might certainly get addressed. We've talked about this problem for several years, actually, the fact that there's all this data out there and sort of the tragedy of the commons. It's in nobody's interest to be the first one to give their data, but everybody would benefit. And now I'm sort of listening to you, and I guess my second question is, what are the reasons that companies would hold back from doing this, from participating in this? Do you feel like we're sort of reaching an inflection point where this actually might really gather momentum and start to happen?
Yeah, I think we definitely are reaching an inflection point where having that better trained model really is more important. And that comes from having more data. I think reasons why companies might hold back would be that their premise is they are, creating a foundation model themselves. So companies like Zyra, where they are really generating a lot of data on their own and building models with that data, I don't think would want to participate in a federated network. But for companies that maybe don't have the capital or the business model of creating their own models for drug discovery, I should say, they are going to benefit more from joining a federated network where they can access a more optimized model.
And sorry, where would you put the farmers within that? Because on the one hand, of course, they could build their own, but on the other hand, external innovation is a big thing for them. So if they could be getting better assets and sort of putting more into the community of biotechs, as it were, it might be in their benefit. How's that playing out?
Yeah, the pharmas are definitely not excluded from the users. And so something that was interesting is that, there's kind of two main platforms for discovery right now, Lilly's TuneLabs platform, and then Afiris has a couple different models or networks that they're hosting as well for drug discovery. And Lilly's TuneLab platform really caters more toward smaller and mid-sized biotechs. Now, they do have some pharma customers or partners, I should say, that are part of the network. But Afiris's customers and partners are mostly larger pharmas. So I think whether or not they're a small company or a large pharma, participating in a federated network still gives a better model output. But the type of network that they join may depend on their competing interests, the resources that they have individually, and like what type of model they're also interested in using.
All right. Lindsay's story will be out this week on the BioCentury platform. Let's turn to NASDAQ now. Lindsay, we're keeping you busy. You're covering a wide range of topics for us.
That's right.
We had a quartet of biotechs get out on NASDAQ last week. Latigo, Blossom Hill, Braveheart, and Atovia. The four brought the year's tally of NASDAQ biotech IPOs to 20. 14 of those produced first day gains, right? Is it 14?
Yes.
And then how much did they all raise and where do we stand year to date, Lindsay?
Yeah, so the four that IPO'd last week raised over 1.2 billion. And then that was really the strongest week that we've had since mid-April. And now the 20 biotechs that have listed on NASDAQ so far this year have together raised over 6.9 billion. And like you said, their first day performance has been largely positive.
Biggest of these last week, as you wrote, Lindsay, was Braveheart. And it is the second largest first day gainer of the year so far. It had a 66% increase. That was good for an end of day market cap of 2.2 billion. Bleeding disorder company Hemab is still king. I think they were up close to what?
Yes. Yeah, they rose 89% on their first day.
One thing that I think that's neat about the chart in Lindsay's story, you all should go look at it. Well, there's not exactly a time axis, but it's arrayed in chronological order, these IPOs. And so when we say, yeah, 14 of 20 had first day gains, well, those cluster in the more recent days, like the ones where they fell on their first day of trading were mostly at the beginning of the year. So that in itself might speak to where things are going.
Yes. Yeah. And something else to know too, just in this past year so far, we've had a couple new cos go public on NASDAQ. And so like Braveheart was a new co that formed by in-licensing assets from Asia. It's the Asia to West new co model. Another example of that was Kylera as well.
All right, Lindsay, how's the IPO queue looking for companies hoping to get out on NASDAQ?
Yeah, the queue is looking a little bit light now that all these companies have gone public last week. But once the fall is back, I'm sure it will pick back up. Right now, we still have Vogenix that filed on July 15th. And then we have Nuvox on the NYSE exchange as well.
Yeah, it seems like companies have some optionality now. IPOs are getting out, and in the world of deals, as we were talking about on our editorial call, it's a real seller's market. So hopefully lining up for a fun fall. Thanks for tuning in to the BioCentury This Week podcast. We will be back next week. If you like what you hear, hit subscribe, tell your friend about us. We're going to come back and talk in more detail about back to school, as we mentioned, in the weeks ahead. And a quick thank you to Kendall Square Orchestra for providing the music for BioCentury's podcast.